Hi folks, Howard here. Welcome to Complexity Unraveled. This is the second part of a four-part series on the global state through the lens of US-China competition. The second part, New Model of Modernization, covers macroeconomics and some profound ideological ramifications. If you haven't checked the primer yet, please consider to do so. It will give you a general idea of the topics we cover in this miniseries. New Model of Modernization. I know it's quite a mouthful. We see it as the way for a nation to achieve prosperity and economic success. If we exclude all the rich oil countries, almost all developed economies belong to the same camp. Liberal democratic society with a free market economy. But we have to make a rather provocative remark. Political system does not guarantee economic success. People's attitudes towards a given government is more influenced by personal well-being than pure ideology. I can still clearly remember the slogan when Ronald Reagan was running for his second term. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? As chilling as it sounds, food on the table, money in the bank, small things matter. One of the rather ironic cases we can refer to is Tunisia. People often associate Arab Spring with Libya and the demise of al-Gaddafi. But it actually started in Tunisia, the Jasmine Revolution. The TLDR version is, Tunisia was run by a dictator for 23 years. Then, a civil revolution took place at the end of 2010. The dictator fled the country and Tunisia was finally liberated. Becomes a democratic nation. After the liberation, more than 60% of the Tunisian people considered democracy as the preferred political system. Then the economy started to slide. By 2014, only 48% preferred democracy. In the latest poll done by Pew Research in 2019, the number went down to 27%. I probably confused quite a few people with everything we said so far. I mean, it is a legit question. Why the hell does all this have anything to do with macroeconomic? Or why does ideology in general have anything to do with economics? Well, here's the thing. The future of the world is less about Western developed countries, but rather determined by today's developing countries. If we look at economic forecasts from any major institution, GDP ranking in the second half of this century would be dominated by countries such as China, Indonesia, India, Brazil, and even Mexico. Basically, you just follow the population. For a lot of the developing countries, especially those from the third world, they are looking for a way out of poverty, a way to improve their economic situation and living standard. And they are facing a rather peculiar situation. 20 years ago, there was no debate. There was only one way to achieve economic success. Today, though, circumstances are changed. You have the Western model shared by most of developed economies, but at the same time, the rise of China certainly has shown the world economic success can be achieved in a different way. You see, if we look around the world, the general sentiment is that democracy is in crisis, under siege, got threatened. There is really no shortage of dramatic headlines. The sad truth is, the state of democracy has been declining for 15 consecutive years. If we look at the survey results, even in Europe, we are at the tipping point. The Western liberal world has seen better days. Looking at today's liberal society, we see civil unrest, inequality in the society, and the rise of nationalism. You cannot help but raise the question whether we still share the fundamental values of democracy. Most of us think democracy as what defined by Abraham Lincoln, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But in reality, what we sometimes witness is how Joseph Stiglitz describes as government of the 1%, by the 1%, and for the 1%. While the Western society becoming a shadow of its former self, busy dealing with its own problems instead of engaging the world, China is actively exporting its national culture, social value, and promoting its political system. China certainly has the economic track record to back them up. People often describe the rise of China as an economic miracle. It is stunning how they managed to get more than 1.4 billion people out of poverty in merely 4 decades. Since the economic reform in 1978, China's GDP has increased 100-fold, from less than $150 billion to over $15 trillion. There is no denial in terms of their economic success. Partially due to the Brexit, China's GDP has already surpassed the European Union. Even though the Chinese economy has slowed down considerably, it is still at a much higher pace compared with the United States and the European Union. In 2021, in the middle of the unprecedented COVID pandemic, China was the only major economy that still managed to stay on the expansive course. In 2021, despite the strict lockdown and zero COVID policy, China was still able to grow more than 8%. The recent forecast indicates that by the end of this decade, China would surpass the United States and become the largest economy. Many people have pointed out China's economy is all about real estate and housing. It is just a facade. Like Japan in the 80s, it will collapse like a house of cards. Ever since the real estate developer Evergrande started making all these negative headlines, more and more people become quite skeptical about China's development. There is no question about the significance of real estate sector in the Chinese economy. Especially considering 70% of personal wealth is reportedly stored in real estate, and the real estate sector itself makes up for almost 30% of China's GDP. But if we take a look at the business sector as a whole, for instance, the number of Chinese enterprises in the Fortune 500. In 1995, only 2 Chinese companies were among the Fortune 500. Fast forward, 25 years later, this number has grown into 124. And do you know how many of them are real estate companies? It might surprise you, only 8. So, to be frank, I'm not so sure that China is the one-trick pony as some people would like to believe. I still vividly remember, like 20-some years ago, when I was still a young graduate, just got into business. China was like this mystical being for us. We didn't understand the culture. We didn't know how to communicate with them. And we certainly didn't know how to do business with them. More than 20 years passed by. People believe we have figured this one out. Now we know how it's done. To be honest, I'm not so sure. You see, Western society generally assumes that Chinese people are living a miserable life, being oppressed and treated like garbage. They need to be saved. There is only one small problem. Many Chinese people do not seem to agree with this opinion. Harvard has done a recent study on the public opinion of Chinese people on their government. And to the surprise of the Western audience, over 95% of Chinese citizens are satisfied. This is really confusing. How could this happen? The research team basically concluded the study with a remark that the Western world tends to forget that for many people in China and in their experience of the past 4 decades, each day was better than the previous one. Just like we mentioned at the beginning, food on the table, money in the bank, small things matter. It's rather questionable whether the Chinese ideology could ever find a broad audience. Nevertheless, the Chinese model of modernization could well become a real option for some developing countries. In this regard, the pandemic and the post-pandemic recovery could have some significant ramifications. We are not going to discuss about vaccination or disease control. Let's place our emphasis on the post-pandemic recovery and look at this purely from a macroeconomic perspective. COVID pandemic is unprecedented by any standard. Worldwide, more than $10 trillion worth of stimulus has been pumped into the system to avoid a total collapse. The last worldwide crisis was arguably the subprime crisis in 2008. To put it side by side with COVID, the COVID stimulus package tripled in size. $10 trillion is a pretty hefty price tag. Taking US as example, more than 1/3 of the M2 money supply, which is essentially the amount of money in circulation, was printed in the last 24 months. Since the beginning of the pandemic, Federal Reserve has purchased more than $5 trillion worth of assets to support the market. We have to point out the significance behind this. Federal Reserve was established in 1922. In the first 98 years of its history, it accumulated a $4 trillion balance sheet. And in the last 2 years alone, $5 trillion was added to it. This is mind-blowing. In the entire economic history, no one has ever seen something at this magnitude. We are literally in uncharted territory. I don't think anybody would be surprised the money printing frenzy and years of quantitative easing have brought some severe consequences. Looking at the commodity market, from energy to agriculture, from steel to lumber, you name it, everything is surging. In all regions, inflations are hitting a multi-decade high. Essentially, everybody is facing the same problem, stagflation. And yet, we are seeing completely different monetary policies. Even though Federal Reserve is still doing asset purchasing right now, Jay Powell finally retired the word transitory. Fed will soon start its tightening cycle. At least 4 to 5 rate hikes are expected in 2022, with a terminal rate clearly above 2%. At the same time, Fed will also start trimming its massive balance sheet, which basically means dumping treasury bond and security into the market. Bottom line, getting the liquidity out of the market at a record pace. In the case of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde essentially follows the footsteps of Mario Draghi, pinning the rate at near zero. Even in a recent interview, they reiterated their stance and argued that the inflation in Eurozone is transitory. To put it differently, nothing happens in Europe. And then you have China. The Chinese central bank came out in January and announced rate cuts in April. At the same time, the commercial bank reserve ratio has been slashed by 50 basis points, effectively injecting even more liquidity into the economy. Mind-boggling is an understatement. Everybody is facing the same problem. US tightens the money supply, EU does nothing, and China pumps more money into the system. I cannot overstate this enough how highly unusual it is to have major sovereign banks misaligned to such an extent. I think it's at least safe to say not all three major economies will come out of this unscathed. It would be such a massive understatement to call the implication just far-reaching. I mean, from real economy to employment, from fiscal policy to capital flow, it will be the whole package. And let's do not forget about technology. It would be a shame if anything from this channel doesn't have some kind of technology component. Even though monetary policy is the most often used instrument to address inflation, people often forget that technology is arguably the single most powerful deflationary force. Looking at this chart, it's more than obvious. Starting from the 80s, when technology really took off, the productivity gain has been outpacing wage growth by a large margin. It's certainly a fair argument to point out that productivity gain does not equal real price. Indeed, price is determined by demand and supply. However, no one would disagree that productivity gain directly lowers the manufacturing cost. Let's have a look at one example together: the clothing industry. Cost pressure in the apparel industry is notoriously brutal. If we look at the past 30 years, while overall retail price more than doubling, the price for clothing barely moved. To be precise, it's even lower compared with 1990 level. People might argue it has nothing to do with productivity gain or technology. It's made possible by extremely low wage. Because they're produced in Vietnam or Bangladesh, where labor conditions could sometimes be rather questionable. This might surprise you. To this very day, China is still the largest producer for clothing and textile by far. Globally, more than 60% of the clothing is still being produced in China. As a matter of fact, the entire fast fashion industry is built upon Chinese manufacturing. And let's do not forget, labor costs in China has increased 50-fold in the course of past 30 years. And yet, technology advancement is still able to fully absorb the additional cost. It's kind of amazing what technology can do. Some people might even argue that transformative technology will push the global economy into a deflationary environment. But there is a catch. Technology is without a doubt the most vulnerable sector to monetary policy. For big techs like Google, Microsoft, Apple, it's not really a problem. They generate tons of cash and sit on billions of dollars. Quantitative tightening could just be a convenient shopping opportunity for them. But for smaller players, cheap money is essential because many of them, even some of the well-known names, are still burning through cash. Yet more often than not, they are the ones who drive disruptive innovation and push transformative technology. People often say the pandemic has forever changed the world. In our humble opinion, though, the change might just have begun. In the post-pandemic world, it is more than just economic recovery on the table. In a much more profound sense, the entire world is watching the clash of ideologies. I hope the second part of this series could be of some help to you. If you are interested in this topic, we have 3 additional videos to shed some more light from geopolitical, industrial, and governance perspective. If you want us to have a deeper look into any of the topics mentioned in this video, feel free to drop a comment. Thank you for tuning in and take care.